With a renewed era of great power competition now well underway, the United States now has 3 new nuclear weapons making their way towards service, including a new air-launched nuclear cruise missile, a powerful new nuclear bomb, and the nation's first new intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, since the 1970s. And with all this nuclear hellfire in development, it's hard not to ask, are we in a new Cold War? Or is this just business as usual? Let's talk about the 21st century nuclear playing field and whether or not the world has gone mad. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Over the past 74 years and counting, the world's nuclear powers have held Armageddon at bay with little more than a steely-eyed promise to escalate any nuclear strike into a global catastrophe, in an apocalyptic balancing act we know as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. But both China and Russia have fielded an array of new nuclear weapons in recent years, prompting growing concern that Uncle Sam's big stick may be too technologically dated to deter the nation's adversaries. But a new generation of American nuclear weapons heading for service right now aim to offset the advantages created by adversary systems and rebalance the delicate scales of MAD. The AGM-181A long-range standoff cruise missile will allow B-52s to conduct nuclear strikes from 4-digit ranges, while the B-63 TAC-13 nuclear bomb will be delivered deep into enemy airspace by the forthcoming and supremely stealthy B-21 Raider. Finally, the LGM-35A Sentinel, America's first ICBM in 5 decades, promises to be the most advanced weapon of its type ever fielded, with an emphasis placed not just on reducing costs and long-term sustainability, but on modular expandability. In other words, America's new ICBM has been purposely designed to carry more weight than it needs, to allow for the rapid adoption of new countermeasures, warhead delivery systems, or even warheads themselves. But strategic deterrence is about a lot more than just fielding capable new weapons. It's about fielding the right ones to serve as a counterweight to those fielded by adversaries. And that's the guiding principle behind America's nuclear triad, which is really the name for a whole collection of platforms, weapons, and delivery systems that are distributed across land-based launchers, sea-based platforms, and aircraft in the air. The idea here is that no matter how potent the enemy's nuclear weapons may be, no matter how destructive their first strike, America will still have nuclear weapons positioned elsewhere that can retaliate. And it's that threat of retaliation, America hopes, that will prevent such a first strike from ever occurring. So with this concept of deterrence in mind, let's briefly run through the nuclear postures of Russia and China in recent years, before we explore the specifics about these new American weapons in a bit more detail. And where better to start than with Russia? Because today, many have a habit of looking at mutually assured destruction as a relic of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, a concept that went away along with duck and cover atomic drills and people building fallout shelters in their backyards. But the truth is, the 21st century is every bit as mad as the 20th, or maybe even a bit worse. Russia's ongoing and largely fumbled invasion of Ukraine may have revealed a laundry list of glaring shortcomings within the nation's sprawling military apparatus, but the weaknesses displayed by Russia's conventional forces might actually make nuclear escalation more likely rather than less. And to substantiate those concerns, you need look no further than just the statements being made by Russian officials on a seemingly weekly basis. Since the invasion of Ukraine began, nuclear threats out of Moscow have become so commonplace that there's an entire Wikipedia page dedicated specifically to them, with at least 12 different instances of Russian officials threatening nuclear war over just the past 20 months. Heck, the most recent one came about a week ago. After Joe Biden compared Russia to Hamas, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov threatened that the fragmentation and incendiary charges Russia's using in Ukraine will soon turn to nuclear ones in response. I mean, I know it's common at this point, but can we talk about just how insane that is? That would be like if Putin called Biden a terrorist and the US responded by having Pentagon spokesperson Admiral John Kirby go on TV and threaten to nuke Syria. Russia's nuclear geopolitical discourse is so wildly irresponsible that it's hard to even imagine a world where most nations could get away with leveling such a threat. Of course, I say most nations because North Korea will threaten to nuke you for just about anything. But Russia's increasing nuclear rhetoric has been mirrored by a variety of new nuclear weapons being put into service. The Kh-47M2 Kinzhal that Russia once touted as a modern hypersonic weapon may be little more than an air-launched ballistic missile, but it is nonetheless a nuclear-capable one that would allow Russian fighters or bombers to launch nukes from standoff ranges. The avant-garde hypersonic glide vehicle, on the other hand, may pose an even greater risk. Hypersonic glide vehicles, or HGVs, could be thought of as an extension of ballistic missile technology, and in fact, the avant-garde is designed to be delivered via Russia's newest ICBM, the RS-28 Sarmat, that's expected to enter service this year. HGVs separate from their booster at a lower altitude than a ballistic missile warhead might, before gliding unpowered toward their targets at extreme speeds, sometimes in excess of Mach 20. But what really differentiates these weapons from traditional ballistic warheads is their use of control surfaces to make unpredictable course changes, at the expense of airspeed, to complicate interception efforts. Now, the RS-28 Sarmat doesn't only carry HGVs, and it's said to be capable of delivering enough warheads to reach a combined 50 megatons of destructive power. That's on par with the largest nuclear weapon ever detonated, which was the Soviet Tsar Bomba. Russian state media outlets have even been quoted as saying that the Sarmat, which is known in NATO circles as the Satan II, can single-handedly wipe out targets the size of France or Texas. Of course, Russia has a number of other nuclear weapons working their way toward service, including the semi-autonomous undersea weapon known as Poseidon, or the Status 6, which is a nuclear torpedo of sorts that was originally claimed to carry as much as a 100 megaton warhead, but now actually appears to be closer to 2 megatons in actual destructive capacity. Nonetheless, this undersea threat, which is rumored to reach speeds as high as 70 knots while submerged, does complicate matters for coastal defense in a nuclear exchange. But to be clear, Russia is no longer the only nuclear threat on the horizon, and that much was laid out in black and white in the Congressional Commission's report on strategic posture that was released just a few days ago. I'll quote it here. The United States will face 2 nuclear peer adversaries for the first time. The Commission concludes that China's rapid expansion of its nuclear forces and Russia's increasing reliance on nuclear weapons and potentially expanded nuclear arsenal are an unprecedented and growing threat to U.S. national security and potentially the U.S. homeland. And that makes this a good time to pivot toward China's rapidly expanding nuclear arsenal. The Congressional Commission's report states that China has shifted the role of nuclear weapons within its broader national security strategy toward what they call an expanded theater nuclear warfighting role. In short, this means China's preparing to face off against an existing nuclear power, specifically the United States, and they've made significant investments to that end since 2020. I'm going to quote a joint statement from Republican lawmakers out of the Congressional Armed Services Committee and the Strategic Forces Panel that was issued in February of this year. It is not an understatement to say that the Chinese nuclear modernization program is advancing faster than most believed possible. Now, that same month, the U.S. Strategic Command issued a notification to Congress, letting them know that China had officially surpassed the United States in total number of ICBM launchers. It's somewhere north of 450 installations. Now, that month, in February of this year, the DoD reported that China had some 400 nuclear warheads stockpiled. But by October of this year, the Pentagon released its annual report on Chinese military and security developments, and the number of warheads in their stockpile had already ballooned to 500, and is proceeding at a rate that's on track to exceed even the most aggressive earlier projections. I'll quote that October report here. Compared to the PLA's nuclear modernization efforts a decade ago, current efforts dwarf previous attempts in both scale and complexity. Now, China currently appears to be nearing completion on at least 300 new land-based ICBM silos, with at least some of these silos already armed with their latest and greatest DF-5C, liquid-fueled ICBMs. Now, this is the longest-ranged and most advanced nuclear weapon in the Chinese arsenal. It's said to be capable of carrying up to 10 separate warheads, or multiple independent re-entry vehicles, which is a significant improvement over their previous DF-5B, which could only carry 3, just like America's Minuteman III, though it's worth noting that the Minuteman is currently limited by policy to just carrying 1 warhead. Now, the total destructive yield of the DF-5C is estimated to be in the 1 to 3 megaton range. As a part of China's nuclear triad, the nation is also fielding the JL-3 submarine-launched ballistic missile, which is said to have sufficient range to reach American soil, even from Chinese coastal waters. And then, of course, you have China's medium-range DF-17, which carries the hypersonic DF-ZF, which is a nuclear-capable hypersonic glide vehicle similar in concept to Russia's Avangard, but designed specifically to take out American aircraft carriers. Now, the Pentagon's assessment suggests that China will have at least 1,000 nuclear warheads by the end of this decade, and while that may not sound like much compared to Russia's 5,889 or America's 5,244, but it's important to understand that neither Russia nor the US keep all of those nuclear warheads combat ready. Instead, both nations keep fewer than 1,500 nuclear warheads ready to launch at any given time. And to that point, the Congressional Commission concluded that at China's current pace, it will reach quantitative parity with the US in deployed nuclear warheads by the mid-2030s. And according to that report, China's accelerated progress is very unlikely to slow even after that happens. In other words, because of this combination of China's nuclear stockpile literally doubling since 2020 and the nation's significant investments into new ways to deliver nuclear warheads, the nuclear boogeyman in a 21st century Cold War is not Moscow, it's Beijing. All right, now that we've got a sense of the competition, let's talk about Uncle Sam's new nukes, starting with the LGM-35A Sentinel, America's new ICBM. America's current ICBM arsenal is made up of some 440 LGM-30G Minuteman III ICBMs with a stated range of some 8,000 miles, or around 13,000 kilometers, and the ability to strike targets within just 120 meters at these extreme ranges, just 30 minutes after receiving the launch command. Now, it is worth noting that that 8,000-mile range is more or less hypothetical. These weapons have been tested out to ranges in excess of 6,000 miles, but they've never been pushed to their limits. Now, these massive 60-foot-tall missiles are usually test-launched at least twice a year, and over their 50-some-odd-year service life, they have demonstrated an extremely high degree of reliability. But it's worth noting that just about a week ago, a Minuteman III test launch was conducted over the Pacific and terminated after an anomaly that is yet to be disclosed, which means we may have just seen a failure, and that really points to just how long in the tooth these weapons have become. The Minuteman family of ICBMs date back to the 1950s, and development on the Minuteman III started in 1966. When these missiles entered service in 1970, they were intended to last just 10 years. but as of today, they've been in service for over a half century thanks to repeated service life extensions. Now, the U.S. Strategic Command recently assessed that yet another service life extension program for the Minuteman III would cost more than just developing and fielding a new ICBM. And to be clear, that's really saying something, because the Sentinel ICBM program is expected to cost as much as $100 billion in all. Now, initially, Boeing and Northrop Grumman were competing for the chance to lead development on this new missile, but in July of 2019, Northrop Grumman went ahead and just bought Boeing's engine supplier, Orbital ATK, effectively ending the competition, and Northrop was awarded the contract about 4 months later. But in an interesting twist, Northrop opted not to use Orbital ATK for their motors and instead farmed that work out to Aerojet Rocketdyne. Just a few days ago, as I record this, on Halloween Day, the Air Force awarded Lockheed Martin nearly $1 billion to continue development on the Mk-21A re-entry vehicle that will be used to deliver the same 475 kiloton W-87 warheads that are currently carried by the Minuteman III. But it's also worth noting that there's a new warhead, the W-87-1, in development, as well as a new next-generation re-entry vehicle, or NGRV, that will both eventually find their way into this weapon. Now, you may note that by carrying a single 475 kiloton warhead, that means Russia's new ICBM, the RS-28 Sarmat, is about 105 times more powerful by yield. But the Air Force contends that a high degree of precision allows for much smaller nuclear yields, and in turn, a cheaper and safer stockpile to maintain. But it is worth noting that the Sentinel, like the Minuteman III, is rated to be able to carry up to 3 of those 475 kiloton warheads. Or, as the Congressional Research Service pointed out, that weight could be used to carry any variety of forthcoming payloads or advanced countermeasures that could limit the chances of intercept. Now, the truth is, the most important part of the LGM-35A Sentinel isn't its destructive capacity, but rather its innate upgradability. The Sentinel ICBM is being designed to be completely modular with open system architecture to allow for rapid and inexpensive upgrades and modifications over the years. And as a result, this ICBM is actually intended to stay in service for at least a half century. Up next is the AGM-181A Long-Range Standoff Nuclear Cruise Missile, or LRSO for short. It's being developed by Raytheon Technologies, now RTX, as an air-launched weapon designed to be carried by the B-21 Raider and, more importantly, the venerable B-52 Stratofortress. Concrete details about this new nuclear cruise missile are somewhat limited, but we know the LRSO is intended to replace America's existing stockpile of some 536 AGM-86B nuclear-armed air-launched cruise missiles, or ALCMs. Now, these weapons have been in service for over 40 years already. Now, with that in mind, it's expected that the LRSO will have an even greater range than the exceedingly long-legged AGM-86B, which can already reach targets as far out as 1,500 miles. Now, this will be vital for the B-52's role in the airborne leg of the nuclear triad, as it will allow this non-stealth bomber to launch nuclear weapons from well outside the reach of enemy air defenses or even most combat air patrols. And with that in mind, it's likely that this new missile will be powered by an air-breathing turbofan engine, likely one that's similar to the Williams F-112 that powers the AGM-86B, as well as the now defunct, even longer-ranged and similarly nuclear-armed AGM-129 advanced cruise missile that was phased out of service about a decade ago due to a combination of high costs, nuclear treaties, and an economic focus on the global war on terror. Now, recently released documents show that the US actually secretly conducted at least 9 flight tests of the LRSO in just the past few years, culminating in a full first system integrated test this past October. Now, during that test, the missile carried an inert test article of its intended nuclear warhead, the W-80-4. Now, the W-80-4 is a life extension program of the existing Dial-a-Yield W-80-1, which is currently carried by those AGM-86Bs. These warheads come with two different yield settings: a relatively small 5 kiloton blast that's about a third of the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945, or a much larger 150 kiloton setting, or about 10 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. Like practically every new weapon in development, the LRSO is being designed with an open system architecture that should allow the Air Force to take bids on upgrades and update efforts in the future from a variety of firms, which will bring down the cost of keeping this new missile viable for years or even decades to come. Now, this missile is intended to enter service in 2030, but based on its testing schedule, it seems to be practically set to go already. The only thing it's waiting on is the W-80-4 warhead program that's expected to be completed in 2027. And finally, we have the B-61-13 nuclear gravity bomb, which was literally just announced a few weeks ago. Now, the United States is already in the midst of fielding the new B-61-12 nuclear gravity bomb, which is a variable yield weapon with a maximum output of 50 kilotons. Now, the B-61-12 is replacing a whole laundry list of existing B-61 series weapons with variable yields ranging from 0.3 kilotons up to around 340 kilotons. And up until just recently, the Air Force said the B-61-12's 50 kilotons would be sufficient to replace even those high-powered nukes, thanks to increased precision delivered by a new guidance system and tail section for the bomb. But then the Pentagon announced the B-61-13, which is supposed to have a 360 kiloton yield, more powerful than the most powerful B-61 bombs that are currently being phased out. And if you find yourself asking what gives, the answer may be that the B-61-13 and its 360 kiloton yield may actually have economic and political targets in its sights rather than strategic ones. You see, the US currently has one nuclear bomb with an even larger yield than the B-61-13 will come with, and that is the massive 1.2 megaton B-83-1. Now, you'll find websites all over the internet claiming the US has 650 B-83s, but the real number is actually almost certainly under 100. According to the Congressional Research Service, the US only has around 475 B-61 and B-83 nuclear bombs combined. And because we know the B-61-12 program is expected to field between 400 and 480 new bombs, and we know the US said they're not increasing their number of weapons, it stands to reason that there are probably 80 B-83s out there, but maybe as many as 100. And that has created some real political turmoil in recent years because despite there being fewer than 100 of these bombs, it still costs more than $52 million a year to maintain them. That's between $520,000 and $690,000 in sustainment costs each year per bomb. Now, the US keeps these pricey weapons around for one specific type of target: heavily fortified subterranean nuclear bunkers. And even though the Air Force claims they can hold any target at risk with a 50 kiloton weapon and increased precision, not all politicians are sold. And as a result, debate about retiring these expensive B-83s has gone back and forth since 2014. And that brings us back to the B-61-13, because, according to the Federation of American Scientists, using a weapon like it with a 360 kiloton yield, but the precision of the B-61-12 could allow it to strike underground targets with yields equivalent to a surface burst of more than 1 megaton. This is thanks to a phenomenon called ground shock coupling. But regardless, it means that the US could hold the same bunkers at risk with this significantly smaller and cheaper nuclear weapon. In other words, even though the Air Force says they only need 50 kiloton bombs, the US may be fielding a 360 kiloton megaton weapon to appease the political holdouts who are preventing the B-83 from being sent out to pasture. And with that reminder that sometimes politics trumps strategy, ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the Force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.